Okay, hi everybody. I will be kind of going first. Then Bridget's going to take over and show first a video presentation from our colleague Sedef, who unfortunately can't be here today. And then Bridget's going to present. We are all doctoral students at the CUNY Graduate Center, and we work with Deb Tolman. And we all realized we were doing research projects using the listening guide, which is a feminist narrative method of qualitative analysis. And we're all kind of asking questions about women's sexuality in different ways. So I'll share my screen. Hopefully this is all going to work. Okay, good. So my research is on young women's sexual desire and understanding their experiences. The thing about women's sexual desire, young women's experiences, is that sexual desire is considered a really important indicator of girls' and women's sexual and relational health and functioning. It's a vital component of women's and really everybody's sexual subjectivity, and yet it's a concept that we use a lot but don't really understand that well in the literature. So it's historically been associated with drive, a sensation, or energy that kind of moves someone towards a sexual behavior, or a subjective experience of wanting to attain a sexual goal. But there isn't a universal definition or model of desire. And I think this has particularly important implications given the abundance of literature and the increasing medical and psychological interventions that we have now to treat women's desire problems. So women's low or absent desire in particular continues to be referenced as a really common issue in need of being fixed. So there's a lot that is said about how much and how girls and women should or should not feel and express their desire, but we have such a limited understanding of what embodied sexual desire actually feels like for women and how they navigate their sexual feelings. So young women's subjective experiences of desire exist and are shaped within a very contradictory social climate where their bodies and desires are at once read as empowered, dangerous, vulnerable, excessive, and also lacking at the same time. So this larger context is really far too often left out of how we conceptualize desire. But Michelle Fine and Sarah McClellan's concept of thick desire locates desire beyond individual bodies and minds. So they really frame desire as a product of intimate and social arrangements and resources. So I'm taking up thick desire as a framework for conceptual analysis, really, of young women's sexual desire that's centered on understanding experience within social and relational contexts and systems of injustice. So what I did is conduct semi-structured narrative interviews with 24 young women who were diverse in terms of race, ethnicity, sexuality, their actual sexual experiences, their relationship status, how they rated their kind of level of sexual desire. And the interviews I conducted lasted about 2 hours. They were on Zoom and were focused on stories of young women's experiences of desire, however they defined it. So the listening guide, I'll kind of go through very briefly, kind of the 4 different steps to a listening guide reading of the transcripts. And then I'm going to use one case to kind of show how the different pieces of this analysis work together. And Sedef and Bridget are actually going to present in a similar way, which hopefully will be useful in seeing how the listening guide works for those of you who aren't using it. So the first reading of a listening guide analysis of a transcript involves reading for the plot or the landscape, in this case of sexual desire. So what was happening in the stories that young women told me about their experiences of desire? The second reading is for a voice of the self, or women's I voice. So I trace here where and how a participant kind of switches between a more active and passive representation of herself, for instance. And then subsequent readings are focused on what are called contrapuntal voices that are based on the research question. So the contrapuntal voices I'm developing are voices of wanting and voices of intrusion. So in listening for want, I'm following multiple kinds of threads of wanting, pleasure, relationship, comfort, wanting, sexual desire itself. And today I'm going to focus on two. The erotic voice, which Sedef and Bridget also use in their analysis. So this is a voice of embodied sexual feelings, of wanting sex, of physical pleasure. The second voice that I have here is the voice of wanting closeness. This is an explicitly relational voice, a voice of wanting intimacy, emotional and physical connection with a partner specifically. And finally, I'm reading for what I'm calling voices of intrusion. And I'm focusing here on the voice of the overthinker. So over and over again, young women told me they're overthinkers or they have an overactive brain. So this voice is a voice of thinking, of feeling kind of unsure, wondering what you should do, rather than being focused on feeling and experiencing. This is perhaps also a voice of the culture, or a way in which hegemonic ideas of desire and sex kind of get mobilized for young women. These are things I'm still kind of working out. Oh, my apologies, I'll go back. So the reason there are these different fonts, so when I go through my analysis, I'm going to show a case study of a participant whose pseudonym is Eleanor, and I'm going to show the different voices. So the voice of the self will be underlined, the erotic voice will be in red, wanting closeness will be italicized, and the overthinker will be in bold. So you can see where these different voices are in her narrative. So Eleanor is the participant. I'm going to walk you through my analysis with her in order to examine the experience of desire in the particular context of a long-term heterosexual relationship. So specifically, I want to show the psychological process through which I see young women's desire getting pushed aside, and how and where it's allowed to surface. So Eleanor here is a 29-year-old white heterosexual woman who has been with her boyfriend for just about a year. And by all accounts, she's happy in her relationship, satisfied with her sex life, fine with her desire. But as we begin to talk about her experiences of desire, she really struggles to voice her sexual feelings. The first story I asked women to tell me about was a time they experienced desire in the last month. And when I asked this of Eleanor, I am immediately introduced to the overthinker. So this is an I poem of her response, just lining up all the lines of the voice of self in her narrative. So she says, I think, I'm thinking, I'm like thinking, I'm trying to figure out, I think I would say I felt sexual desire. So she thinks she felt sexual desire after a lot of thinking. I ask her how her desire feels, and I start to get a glimmer of her voicing her embodied sexual feelings. She says, my heart starts to beat a little faster. But the erotic immediately gets subsumed by the overthinker. She says her desire often comes with not really knowing if what I'm doing is right. I tend to be unsure of myself. In an effort to answer my question, though, she does go back to the erotic, and this time wanting and feeling come through. Her wanting voices join here to express an embodied sensation and a physical longing for closeness. So instead of thinking, she says she wants to be closer, to touch a lot more. She wants skin-to-skin contact. And I see Eleanor primarily expressing her erotic voice in tandem with this voice of wanting closeness. That was not abnormal for a lot of the women I spoke to, especially those in long-term relationships. But her sexual desire is not just about sex, but it is also very much about sex. As I ask Eleanor to tell me more about this experience, though, the overthinker completely swoops back in. There's this voice of wanting closeness that is still there, but her erotic voice just disappears. So she tells me a story that she describes as her usual experience of desire, where in the course of a sexual encounter, she follows a pretty set script of giving her boyfriend oral sex before the intercourse that she says she wants to have. So she says in the process of this experience, I just get self-conscious. I start to overthink. Should I keep doing this? Should I keep touching instead of moving to the act? Is this what we're enjoying right now? And now we're is really code for is this what he is enjoying for right now? She says, should I stick to that? Should I? Right? Just all of these shoulds overtake everything. Ultimately, she says, I'm more concerned about making sure that he's having a good time. Right? So she's more concerned about making sure that he has a good time than expressing, or really maybe fully even recognizing or feeling her own sexual desire. She knows she wants sex. She tells me so, but she's so afraid that if she made this move and if they, she says, didn't vibe right, or he preferred the oral sex, then it would be a complete failure on her part. She would put the onus on herself for him not being as happy with the encounter. So what I see happening is the overthinker working with her desire for closeness to control her erotic, to control what she is and is not allowed to want. Her own sexual desire is there. I see glimmers of it, but it's in this battle with the overthinker. So ultimately, in what Eleanor is describing as her normal sexual experience, her thinking wins out over her embodied feelings and her desires lost. So she performs sex as a chore for the good of the relationship, her partner's pleasure, right? And she doesn't allow herself to want more than that. But when I invite Eleanor to tell me a different kind of story, I ask her to tell me a story about when she felt desire that was exciting for her. I also asked her to tell me a story when desire was important to her. And here she tells the same story for both of these questions, and it's a very different story than what we just heard. She tells me about a time where she and her boyfriend spent all day in bed together. There was a lot of touching and kissing, she said, and there was some sex, but they didn't care if it turned into sex or not. So this is a story where her voices of wanting align, her erotic voice and voice of wanting closeness. It's a context of intimacy where the erotic voice is flourishing, wanting flourishes. So she had a freedom, she says, to just be able to do what she wanted, move however she wanted. There was no expectation. Whatever came up next was up to her. And even if she did something to make him happy, she says it was because she wanted to. So when the overthinker doesn't come in to interrupt, her agency is based on her own embodied feelings rather than her head. Eleanor is very tearful as she reflects on this experience with me. She says it's really special to her because it doesn't happen very often. She talks about feeling incredibly loved. And it's in this context of emotional intimacy and connection, when her want for closeness is already fulfilled, she's got it, she's free from having sex as a chore and free to want more for herself, to make space for her erotic. This is an I poem of that narrative. The last few sentences, she just says, I wanted, I was happy, I wanted, right? So what is this way of listening tune us into, or what am I hoping it helps tune us into, is that desire is multidimensional, the multiplicity of desire, that it is always relational and situated in particular contexts, right? Context was really important in how she experienced her desire and allowed herself to navigate it. And this is a woman she's a young woman, she's in a happy relationship. She doesn't report low desire at all. right? And yet she really struggles to hold on to and feel entitled to her own sexual feelings in her relationship. So looking at what this struggle is and why and how it happens highlights this role of the overthinker, right? It has a purpose in the larger context of women's navigations of their desire. The purpose is to control the body's wanting to fit within overarching gendered expectations, to prioritize male desire and pleasure, sex as emotional and physical labor for women, to keep her desire in check so that it does not become excessive, right? And looking at how this voice of overthinking works with the voice of wanting closeness to push away the erotic, I think shows a psychological mechanism by which femininity ideologies yield outcomes of disconnection for girls and women, disconnection from their bodies and voices and desires. And at the same time, tracing wanting also shows how it's really not enough to simply tell women, oh, go ahead, it's fine. You can have desire, you can have sex, nobody's judging you, right? For many of the young women I spoke to, their erotic voice was really closely intertwined with their desire for intimacy. So their erotic often, not always, but many times is not just about wanting physical pleasure devoid of connection. Now, it's also not just a desire for connection devoid of wanting physical pleasure, but these contexts of intimacy seem to open up a space for the erotic, creating this freedom to want. And ultimately, I think this framing of wanting and the listening guide are helpful in opening up and answering questions about the conditions needed for wanting, for embodied desire really to become possible. So thank you very much. That's all to me. I really want to thank, SexGen, Bridget and Sedef and Deb Tolman, and also SQIP for the small grants for graduate research students. That was extremely beneficial in helping to fund this study. So thank you so much and for having us present. So I'll turn it over to Bridget and she'll share Sedef's and then her presentation, and then we'll go to questions if that works for everybody. And I also apologize if you were hearing my 2-year-old in the background.
All good. Hi, thanks, Jen. Appreciate it. Hi, everyone. As Jen said, I'm Bridget, and I'm going to be playing. Sedef is in Turkey right now, and I don't know what time it is there. So hopefully she's sleeping, honestly. No, but I'm going to share. She gratefully recorded her presentation, which I'm going to share. Oh, hold on. Before I do that, I have to make sure to share my sound. Please let me know if you can't hear or see anything. I will be happy to adjust, but you should be able to see this now.
Hi, everyone. I'm very happy to be part of SQIP this year, and I unfortunately couldn't be there on time today, so I'm recording my presentation. Hope you enjoy my presentation, and I also hope that you enjoy Jen and Bridget's presentations. All right, so today I'm going to be talking about tracing sexual empowerment in the psyche, and I'm going to do that by focusing on a case study of a Turkish immigrant woman. The way I came to sexual empowerment was interesting. As a critical psychologist who's interested in liberation, my questions to women from Turkey were about how they make sense of liberation. But my research took an unexpected turn when their answers were not necessarily about liberation, but about sexual empowerment instead. So when I asked Leyla, the first interviewee in my research, to tell me a story about a time when she felt liberated, her response was that it's not intrinsic to me to use my sexuality to get to a place of power. So that was really interesting to me. So as a researcher and listener, I tuned into what my participant was telling me, and I followed her in leading me in a direction which I had not anticipated. So my research question then became, how do I make sense of how sexual empowerment comes up when I specifically ask about liberation? So just a bit of background. Beicheng urges us to look at empowerment's original conceptualization, in which empowerment is very much tied to liberation. It's about taking action to eradicate identified power blocks and imbalances in solidarity with others. But recently, there's a cannibalization of empowerment when empowerment is stripped away of this critical consciousness and social action. Then it becomes very much of a social self-improvement discourse. And it's it emphasizes competition with others rather than joining with them. So there's also the commodification of empowerment that contributes to that cannibalization. And just a bit of a set of theories that I'm drawing from are critical sexuality studies, psychodynamic, intersectionality, and transnational feminism. So in order to understand Leila's psyche, I'm using the listening guide method, which Bridget and Jen will also talk about. So the listening guide method is a voice-centered, qualitative feminist approach to narrative analysis that emphasizes relationality throughout the research process. So it has a series of steps, including multiple readings of the text. And by identifying those multiple and often contrapuntal voices in one's psyche, the listening guide method focuses on uncovering the psychological logic of individuals, focusing on understanding an individual's associative rather than rational logic. So I focus on the case of Leila, the original interview, in a larger study about liberation. Leila is a 28-year-old Turkish heterosexual woman from Ankara who moves in between Turkey and New York. So I focus on this interview as it is a clear example of how the listening guide method allowed me to understand how sexual empowerment operates in the psyche and how it may lead to creating binds in women's psyches, and how Leila's psyche reveals one particular way of how women psychologically solve these binds. So specifically reveal how identifying voices in her psyche were important tools in discovering the associative logic in her mind, and which then led me to understand larger patterns in how sexual empowerment relates to liberation. And then, as my analysis reveals, how empowerment may actually get in the way of liberation. So I also situate myself as a listener in this interview. I think it's important to note, as I am a Turkish immigrant woman myself, listening to her in this interview. And I also paid attention to research and discourses of immigration, of heteronormativity and sexuality research in the US as well as in Turkey, to understand the dialectic between her own body and the social scripts that her body is embedded in. So as I mentioned, you identify voices in a listening guide method. So there's the voice of the self, in which you follow the I statements, and it is known as the anchor of the listening guide method. And then I identified 4 voices. So one is the voice of cognition. So this voice captures the perceiving, the recognizing, the categorizing, and the reasoning self. So Leila sees herself as an intellectual woman, and she also identifies herself as a categorizer. She says, I think I let myself categorize other women. So the voice of cognition here tracks the analytical, logical, and that categorizing approach she takes in making sense of her own experiences. And this voice is especially prevalent throughout the interview and comes to light with the verb think. And so for Leila, this voice also operates as a way to put people, and especially women in this case, into categories. And it works in tandem with the phenomenon of slut shaming. So women who are slut shamed are put into the abject box of sluts, and then they use their sexuality to get to a place of power. So this is an excerpt from the interview. Then we have the voice of feeling under wraps. So this voice describes more of the deep-seated emotions that Leila has trouble voicing. So, and she also names, she says this in the interview where she says there's this stuckness in her throat. It seems to live beneath the spoken words. And it alludes to the parts that are not explicitly said, that are hidden, that are psychologically protected, that are very much filled with ambiguity, with negations and hedges. So, and this voice seems to reflect that fraught relationship that Layla has with voicing desire and voicing vulnerability. It's around those times when she is kind of talking about desire or vulnerability that stuckness in her throat comes up. So yeah, that is the voice of feeling under wraps. Then we have the voice of subtle sexuality. So in the interview, Layla defines herself and her sexuality as being subtle. She says, I think it's just a characteristic of mine that I think I'm flirting and it's not quite happening. You know, I have a very subtle way of doing things. So for Layla, subtle is about being delicate. It's about how her sexuality can be hard to detect. She flirts and it doesn't quite happen. She stares at someone and they don't return that the gaze back. So for Layla, it's about how her sexuality is so delicately complex and understated that it almost always goes unnoticed. So yeah, this voice is the voice of subtle sexuality, and the voice of the erotic voice is the voice of sexual feelings and desire. It is embodied, and it is how sexuality feels in the body and the awareness that comes with that. And the most eloquent depiction of the erotic voice is in Audre Lorde's The Uses of the Erotic as Power, where she describes the erotic as a life force. So for Layla, it's hardly present in the interview, but she does have access to her erotic voice. And this is the voice that says, I want all of this, in which she sort of explicitly states her feelings. So yeah, that is the erotic voice. So I will only focus on an excerpt for the analysis, just to show how I've gone through the analysis, just for the sake of time. So in this excerpt, this is the excerpt when I ask her to elaborate more on what sexual empowerment looks like for her. She says in this excerpt that she says she feels sexual empowerment when there's no fear of being misunderstood, when she feels at ease, and then she also justifies her subtlety in sexuality through the subtleness of her personality. She says, you know, it's just that I'm subtle in everything. And so here we see the voice of the self in green, underlying again, like the I statements here. And we also, I also underline when it's turned to you as well, because that could also say a lot about someone's psyche. And we also see the voice of cognition here in blue, underlined in blue. And we very much see how the voice of cognition moves in tandem with the voice of the self. She, it's clear that she identifies herself through her thinking self. The cognition dominates the self, even though the questions are about feeling, about desire, but her answers are very much about I think, I don't think, I think, I don't think. Yeah, so we also see categorizations here. You know, fear of being misunderstood is there. And we see metacognition. So she kind of takes, she goes outside of her body to look at herself and say, you know, there's this sort of looking at how she sees herself, and which requires a bit of disembodiment. And we also see justifications. We see a justification of her subtlety, of her subtle sexuality through her subtle personality. Yes, and then we also have here the voice of subtle sexuality in pink, right? I think I'm flirting and it's not quite happening. You know, I have a very subtle way of doing things. It's partly that I'm subtle in everything. So throughout the interview, Layla seems to find herself in a psychological bind. She searches for an intricate solution that will allow her to feel empowered without being categorized. So she says, it's still a question for me what empowering sexuality looks like for me. She tries to find an answer in this bind against the constraints of categorizations that creates a binary between sexuality and intelligence. And she seems to find a solution through the voice of subtle sexuality. So I noticed that she's hiding her sexuality behind her intellect and creativity. In the interview, at some point, she says, if I'm seen that way, sexual, if I'm seen sexual right away, then I can't build on my intelligence or creativity. I also find evidence in the overuse of I thinks in her poem and the way Leila talks about sexuality through the analytic lexicon without almost any references to desire and feelings. It seems that Leila's sexuality may be hiding behind her intelligence, making it hard to detect it or even feel it. So the psychological logic evidenced here is that if her own sexuality is delicate or precise as to be difficult to analyze or describe, then people will not be able to pigeonhole her. So she will escape the categorizing. So being sexually subtle may be a solution to the bind of escaping categorizing, avoiding punishment, and still asserting sexual empowerment. So thinking about this interview, this excerpt here, even though subtle sexuality might be a solution, it's also a very costly solution. So the erotic voice is hardly ever there, though we see glimpses of it at times. The absence of the erotic voice shows how employing subtle sexuality is a non-solution solution. So this solution enables her to be empowered or say that she's empowered, claim empowerment, and enables her to shift away from potential embodied vulnerability and desire to safe embodiment. Because at some point she also says, I like to come from a place of power and not vulnerability. So she's kind of escaping vulnerability, embodied vulnerability. So these solutions then show, like especially subtle sexuality, the solution that she employs does not seem to allow room for, even though it allows to solve a particular problem, it doesn't seem to allow room for vulnerability, for desire, or play. So, and that's why there is that obfuscation of liberation. So that gets me to my interpretation, which is that sexual empowerment seems to get in the way of liberation. So liberation here refers to freedom from internal and external restrictions. It encompasses freedom that have psychic, social, and political layers in which an individual experiences internalized and embodied states of freedom, while in solidarity with others in achieving the political goal of releasing others from restrictions as well, which this is Maxine Green's sort of conceptualization of freedom. So liberation requires those embodied feelings that the hegemonic discourse keeps out, as well as the connection and solidarity with others, challenging the competition that the contours of slut-shaming and heteronormativity create. So empowerment in this context is a fraught process. It's something an individual does that seems disembodied, that seems analytical and strategic. So, and the neoliberal, that hegemonic and that cannibalized version of empowerment discourse interferes with this process instead of helping it. So some of the implications of this research, one important implication is intersectionality in the listening guide method. So here, I couldn't get much into that in this presentation, but I get to it in my paper, in which I look at how race, ethnicity, class, immigration, and place may inform and deepen our interpretations in the listening guide analysis. So I bring in sexuality discourses in Turkey as well, in which most of sexuality discourses are focusing on danger. So if we think about sexuality as Carol Vance's conceptualization as danger and pleasure, the discourses in Turkey are specifically focusing only on danger. And so bringing in Espin's work of immigration and sexuality, looking at how the empowerment discourse in the West and the risk discourse in Turkey might be sort of creating these contradictory discourses, contradictory values for Leila. And again, how Espin says how immigrant women may struggle with these contradictory discourses. It's important for transnational solidarity, asking these questions in other places and forming global and local solidarities are very important. And also it's important for raising important questions that pave the way towards social change. So asking a question such as, what will it take for Leila to find a solution, to feel that embodied power, vulnerability, and desire in pursuit of liberation? So diving deep into Leila's psychological logic through the listening guide method reveals how that do-it-yourself discourse pushes heterosexual women into non-solution solutions that allow them to some room to come up for air, yet not enough room for play, desire, and freedom. So the lexicon of sexual empowerment interacts with what women know from their experience. And the listening guide method allows us to uncover that psychological logic that holds ways of women, how women solve those psychological problems. So through tracing these voices in Leila's psyche, I uncovered one way of solving that psychological bind, which is through subtle sexuality. Subtle sexuality seems like a good solution, but requires a sacrifice of the self that is undermining of liberation. And it keeps the systems such as slut shaming and heteronormativity in place. So the expense of the solution was made visible through the listening guide method and embedded in qualitative feminist theory, and uncovering these psychological logics that constitute non-solution solutions makes these systemic binds visible, which is a necessary step in finding liberatory pathways. Thank you so much. I hope you enjoyed my presentation, and thank you, Bridget and Jen, and looking forward to hearing your presentations as well.
I want to say thanks to Sedef wherever she is right now, which fantastic as always. I'm going to share my presentation now, if I can get it up here, and we can get started on that and wrap it up quickly. Okay, perfect. All right, hi everyone. My name is Bridget Woods, as been mentioned already multiple times, I think. I'm grateful to be here at SQIP, and I'm also extra excited because myself and many other students actually, but also including Dr. Tolman, are on the sort of inaugural committee at the CUNY Grad Center for our first qualitative concentration in psychology. So it's just very exciting to be amongst other folks who are sort of talking about the influence of qualitative research, which is just always exciting. Tonight, I'm going to be speaking about what I'm calling that magical heart feeling. And so I'm looking at queer and queering spirituality through listening guide analysis. I'm also hoping to cut down on some things so we don't have a repetition too much of some of the listening guide stuff, but it's exciting. So I think it'll be good. Okay, so I began this project in an attempt to start teasing out the intersection of queerness and spirituality and what that could potentially look like. While my curiosity lingered around queer identity, queer sexuality, and where, if at all, this existed amongst this resurgence of spirituality in the dominant discourse, it also started to slip a little into the in-between. I was interested in queer women's identities and their experiences with spirituality, but I was also started, not at the beginning, but as I went through this project, really started to be attracted to this very ephemeral and slippery term of queering. What did that mean exactly? Was it embedded in queer identity? Did it have to come from queerness itself? And what did it do? In this instance, for the notion and understanding of spirituality and its meaning for queer women in particular. In engulfing myself in research around queering anything and everything I could find, I found it often housed itself in two distinct places, specifically in psychological research. First, and understandably, in queer identities and lived queer experiences, offering analyses incorporating both self-identity and identity within social context, emphasizing performance and rejecting essentialization, and generally calling for further integrations of queer theory into standing identity development theories. In identity development, queering, when present, offered ways of being or doing queer in respect to one's experiences. However, what I was finding was that the action of queering, the actual process of it, remained vague and undefined outside of these particular contexts. In the second vein, queering pedagogy and methodology allowed for points of departure from the normative and challenged traditional approaches and interpretations of various disciplines. A scholar I became very enthralled with, Karen Mackey, called for a distinguishing of queering from queer and an unpacking of what these terms could do, as well as an offer of queering as what she calls an intervening, a quote, recentering of sexual and gender knowledge from a normative perspective to a perspective of the margins, end quote. So coming back to my research, grounded in Gloria Anzaldua's concept of spiritual activism, and the potential intersection of queerness and spirituality, I started with a curiosity of how queer women construct narratives of their spirituality and their spiritual practice. But it's important I find it important to note that this analysis and this interpretation emerged from queer voices. However, what I heard and thus what I uncovered was not just or not solely about queer experiences, but also about the process of queering something as magical as spirituality. So asking this question, right, this real question that could be answered, I approached the listening guide. As has been previously stated, it's a feminist methodology with radical listening at the core of its analysis. It centers the psyche, understanding the interlocking nature of psychological processes and sociocultural dimensions under which they're happening. It's highly relational, emphasizing relations between the self and others, and between the self and the conditions under which we come to understand the self. The listening guide listens for a set of voices that speak around, between, with, and in tension with each other to shed light on a narrative, listening not just to the words, but how they're said, and just as importantly, how they are not said or what is not said. Tensions are inherent in the listening. Like I said, listening for what's said and what's unsaid, but also what is on the surface and what lingers below. For me and for my research, the listening guide was the way I felt I could listen to queer women, to uncover if and where a psychological process was occurring, and to hear what they were trying to tell me. In this process, the listening guide was the way I felt I could explore queerness. And I think that's important. I highlight this multiple times because I genuinely don't believe outside of this methodology, I would have come to the conclusions or to the interpretations that I did that feel important and big and unique. So again, I'm going to go through this relatively briefly. Understandably, listening is part of each step of the listening guide. It calls for an outlining of the landscape of the narratives, of listening for the voice of self, your own voice as the listener, as has been highlighted. I think that's one of the most critical parts of the listening guide. and the voices that emerge to ebb and flow in a single narrative. And finally, which is sort of what I'm bringing to the listening guide today, is an analysis across narratives and the interpretation of that. This also feels relatively intuitive to say, but I find it important also to say that the way you get to the interpretation is through writing. How I hear these voices and how they're moving through and with each other, where are their knots and where are their tensions, and what does that illuminate or try to hide. The most important takeaway from doing a listening guide analysis, I would say, is that the way voices move with each other, amongst each other, has meaning for individuals, for the listener, and for the overarching narratives themselves. So I had interviews with two queer women that I'm going to talk about today and talk about sort of my analysis across these three interviews I did with them. So I began with Sirona, who was a queer woman who I interviewed twice about a year apart, and who identified as Muslim with intersecting spiritual practices. Three voices emerged alongside her voice of the self, the voice of back and forth, the voice of do's and don'ts, and the voice of the heart feeling. I'm showing one way in which I listened to the interactions and intersections of Sirona's three voices, how they moved and flowed with each other, and when one overlapped one another, either to highlight or to silence. But there's a particular part I'm going to emphasize, so I might go through this part a little bit quicker. But what I'll say is that the voice of back and forth was marked by uncertainty. Going back was a manner of protection from the unknown. Going forth was venturing into the unknown. And for Sirona and her relation to her spirituality, there was constant tension, constant juxtapositions of movement and stagnation, all riddled with uncertainty. Uncertainty for the past, for the present, and for her future. But what I want to focus on for this analysis was the voice of the heart feeling. For Sirona, the voice of the heart feeling emerged in contrast to rules and expectations. It countered notions of thinking as the only valuable sites of knowledge and meaning making. Its mechanism was to provide purpose and to envision interconnectedness and community. While often bookended by the voice of do's and don'ts, the rules, the binaries, right? You must be this or that. There's no in between here. The voice of the heart feeling was a way to kind of get into that in-between a little bit, to challenge that a little bit, and to imagine the future and provide comfort and support. And I'll come back to this heart feeling in but a moment. The other woman I spoke to was Lilith. And for Lilith, a Jewish queer woman with her own spiritual practice, I also heard three voices, the voice of the wounded healer, the voice of affirmations / mantras, and the voice of magic. The voice of magic underlaid much of Lilith's narrative, flowing between and around the voice of the wounded healer and the voice of affirmations. The voice of magic was the undercurrent of her entire spiritual practice. It broke through during moments of intense emotion and embodiment. It cushioned her during moments of uncertainty, and it allowed movement through tension without getting stuck or stagnant. What came from this analysis of both of these women in their individual interviews, but then listening across the narratives is where we're going to spend a little bit of time right now. So listening across, I was able to interpret patterns of voices and thus find meaning. Through listening, I was unwrapping the heart of what their spirituality meant and what it did for them. From my initial analysis, as I said, I uncovered the two contrapuntal voices, the voice of the heart feeling and the voice of magic. But again, listening across and between, these voices became integrated, and I heard something new developing, a voice that could transcend just one narrative, just one story, and also provide insight into its process. The voice of the heart feeling and the voice of magic became the magical heart feeling voice. As I revisited both narratives, I heard the magical heart feeling voice, which was distinct from the two previous ones. And it became, I would think, an incredibly important discovery for me. For Sirona, The magical heart-feeling voice sounded a little like, I think that I was just trying to find that way that was like kind of kept me going, even though I couldn't really see it. And for Lilith, it sounded a little like, I was like, this feeling of being alone is because it's universal, like you're not alone in it. There is this connection. So it's like, I don't know, that this is something that's like a big like undercurrent of like all my work. When I listened for the magical heart feeling voice, I heard how the search for a spiritual practice was deeply felt in the body. I heard how feeling is embodied knowledge. I heard how queer women longed for interconnectedness and community, and that queerness was one part of that, of a whole, right? It was an important part, but one part. I heard how spirituality was magic and magic was feeling, and how all of this was deeply rooted in ideas of social and political justice. Now, I'm very glad Jen mentioned that I brought up the erotic voice in my analysis, because I have been working sort of through this, where the erotic voice is shockingly absent from a lot of these narratives. And this, I think, is just as important to note as what is present or what is louder or heard more. In speaking of embodied knowledge in queer lives, right, I need to explore what I'm calling, at least for right now, elusive sexuality. The presence is there, but it's very hard to grab onto. Sexuality was an incredibly slippery concept through these interviews, which I think is incredibly intriguing, because I was specifically talking about queerness and spirituality and mentioned that to the two women I spoke to as well. For Sirona, sexuality was a source of consternation that emerged at other sites of tension, specifically in her reconciling with not only what she'd been taught, but also just what she had been exposed to growing up. Sirona, in our first interview, felt deep uncertainty about where sexuality came into play in her spiritual practice and in herself generally. And she says, I'm always trying to work out through my beliefs about sexuality, but like, I don't really, my own sexuality that way, maybe it's because I have yet to fully reconcile. And when I say my sexuality, I don't just mean like, oh, because like I'm not straight, but I also mean having sexuality because of the way I was raised. However, in our second interview, there was a distinct shift in how Sirona understood both her own sexuality, but also her willingness to name it. And she said, but I think in a more like personal note, like a lot of my identities exist at the in-between. You know, people, I hate that, but they kind of do, you know? Like I'm like a bisexual person, and like I feel like there's a lot of pressure on someone who identifies as bisexual or pansexual or whatever. I don't even identify as bisexual, but it's just like I hate labels, but for the sake of shorthand, whatever. In our first interview, I expressed to her a little bit of my research question, and I was the one to explicitly ask about queerness, her own, but also within her spiritual practice. In our second interview, she was the one to instigate this conversation around sexuality, even though she was still a little uncertain, a little not sure. She took that initiative. So this presence of a tense and uncertain specter of sexuality in Sirona's stories emphasizes the process of another voice I uncovered, the voice of back and forth, which I mentioned. Marred by fluctuations and precarity, this voice is the working through the malleability and the instability of both spirituality and sexuality. And just as intriguing is a marked absence of sexuality in Lilith's stories, which offers me more questions into where sexuality can live and where it cannot in stories of spirituality, and where the erotic voice, as both Jen and Sedef mentioned and heard in their stories, where that might emerge or has the potential to emerge. So to wrap up, I began this project asking a question of how queer women construct narratives of their spirituality and spiritual practices. And I followed the listening guide method to listen for and uncover potential psychological processes. However, all of this was done without the intention of queering, right? Or even understanding exactly what that was in the beginning. It was a specter at the back of my psyche, my own psyche, but I did not know how to define it. I didn't know how to see it or hear it, or to understand what its purpose was. and utilizing the listening guide to listen to queer voices, centering the voices of people who are not often heard, I was able to hear how spirituality was being queered, and that this was done through the conceptualization of the magical heart feeling. The magical heart feeling queers what spirituality is and what it does. In queering spirituality, we recenter embodiment and feeling. In queering spirituality, I'm not solely talking about queer spirituality or the spirituality of queer people, although that is there and present and must be acknowledged. In queering spirituality, we are attempting to move through boxes and boundaries. The magical heart feeling highlights the evasive nature of binaries and the sometimes invisible process of queering. The purpose of spirituality is transformed and becomes something different. It's not something to be neatly categorized, similar, I would say, to queer identities. Rather, the magical heart feeling makes audible what the process of developing and enveloping oneself in spirituality does for an individual. It queers, it renders feeling meaningful, it centers justice, and it transcends borders and boundaries. And thank you.